Our next speaker is Professor Susan Athey, Economics of Technology Professor in the Graduate School of Business and Professor of Economics Kersey. Senior Fellow at Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Her interests are in industrial organization, microeconomic theory, and applied econometrics, focusing on the design of auction-based marketplaces and the economics of the internet and news media and online advertising. She has studied dynamic mechanisms in games with incomplete information, comparative statics under uncertainty, and econometric methods for analyzing auction models. Please welcome Professor Athey.
So thanks very much. I'm really excited to be here today. Actually, just to pick up on that last question about delayed rewards, that is actually a really crucial area of study in applying these things in practice. And so there's actually a separate line of sort of methodological research about how to construct those rewards. Actually just posted a new version of a paper yesterday addressing that issue, so it's top of mind. So if anyone is interested in talking more about that, in real applications, deciding how to come up with the best proxy measure that's available in the short term, using, say, historical observational data is kind of the key blocker, really, to implementing a lot of these things in practice. So I do a fair bit of methodological research myself, but today I thought I would mix it up with all of the methodology you'll see today with a more applied project. So I want to talk about a paper I've recently written about service quality in the gig economy using telemetry to understand driver behavior at Uber. One of the reasons, actually this is not the reason I started the paper, but one of the reasons now I like to present the paper is I think it really gets you thinking about something that's going to be a huge trend for AI applications across industries, and that is that AI allows us to measure the quality and performance of workers at scale. So if we think about what AI can do, we can observe workers and service providers. If it's a marketplace, they're not employees, but we can observe workers through a variety of approaches. So in this paper, we're going to talk about the telematics from your phone. I think probably most people in this room know, but just in case you didn't, your phone can tell everything about what you do. If you have an Android phone, about 30 or 40 pieces of telemetry a minute are uploaded about what you're doing, so you can tell if your phone was in your pocket or in your backpack, if you brought your phone with you to the bathroom while the Samsung TV is showing you a commercial, how fast you're driving, whether the phone is mounted, whether the phone is bumping because you're texting and driving, or because it's just bouncing around in the seat next to you. All of that is available through AI with your phone, and that's being deployed already in practice for anybody who has large fleets, and that's the kind of data I'll show you today. But there's many other applications of this. When we have manufacturing firms, you have cameras on all of your assembly lines. If you're a bank, you have cameras on your tellers. And so it's actually very straightforward to build a model where you use humans to label the quality of the interaction. Did this person have a safety violation on the assembly line? Is this a very productive assembly line? Is this an assembly line that stops frequently? And just build a simple AI model with off-the-shelf techniques to give every minute of every assembly line 24/7 a score. And then, of course, once you get those scores, you can come back and review whether there was actually a violation. We've also recently seen that Microsoft implemented analytics on Office 365 so that you can see how much time you're spending in email and in meetings. Large financial firms use AI to read everybody's email and score it for risk of insider trading or other types of violations of policy. So not just assembly line workers and Uber drivers, but you, all of you in your jobs, will also ultimately within a few years be monitored and surveilled for what you're doing. And those will be given scores of various types. They might be used for promotions or for compliance purposes. And so when we think about how easy it is to build this, so the model that I'm going to show you, the base version was very easy for one graduate student to build on a laptop. you end up realizing this is going to be very widespread, and it's something that we need to think about from a policy perspective, from a regulation perspective, from a labor management perspective, and from a discrimination perspective, of course, because these algorithms might be bad at short people, they might be bad at brown-skinned people, and so on. And so we could have various, and if you think people are upset about Google Images giving you biased results, think about how people are going to feel if their workplace is giving you biased results and it's affecting their wages and promotions. So big issue coming forward. That's not, all of those issues is not what this paper is about, but I think they're things that will be big topics of research going forward. So what I wanted to study in this paper, I've been doing a lot of research. Before I started doing machine learning research, I was focusing on marketplaces and auctions, and I've been doing that for about 20 years. One of the key insights in that literature is that the way that you design markets and the entrance of new marketplaces really affects the industry structure. So we can think about things like Uber or Airbnb as allowing new entrants, in some cases micro-entrepreneurs, individual people, to operate a business. It might have been too difficult for them to establish a reputation and acquire customers in the past, but now marketplaces allow small businesses to enter easily and operate, and so on. So the one question is, does that help or hurt equilibrium quality in the industry? And actually, the answer is going to be it depends. So I have some other research showing how it can hurt quality in news. And of course, we just need to look at, say, the 2016 election to understand that. There were lots of new news outlets that popped up that never would have been able to find an audience before. And indeed, they didn't find an audience through search engines, but through social media, they were able to find an audience very quickly. So these platforms allow a brand new entrant with no reputation to get found and discovered by its consumers rapidly, and that can be bad for quality in news. On the other hand, I'll show you evidence today that it helps in ride sharing. So in the case of the gig economy, one of the key welfare benefits of the gig economy is a flexible labor supply. And people have used a variety of empirical techniques to show, using revealed preference, that drivers really value the flexibility in Uber. You see that because the prices, the hourly rates they can work vary quite a bit, and workers don't respond to those variation in wages, which suggests that they actually aren't available to work, or it's not convenient for them to work when they could make more per hour, and they choose to make less per hour in order to fit their schedules. If that's the case, if this flexibility is really valuable, then we want to make sure that we can allow people to enter flexibly. We don't want to have big entry barriers. But something like, so the question would then become, how do these marketplaces and ride sharing guarantee quality while allowing flexibility? So there's a myth that things like ride sharing provide flexibility, low prices, and convenience at the expense of experienced, higher quality service providers. Now, those of you who are old enough to have ridden in a lot of taxis might already find that suspicious from your own experience about quality. But what I'm going to show here is empirical evidence that the UberX provides higher quality. And so when we think about quality, there's many aspects of quality. What I'm going to focus on this paper is the aspect of quality that can be measured through telemetry. So I'm not going to try to get other aspects of quality, how friendly the drivers are and things like that. We're just going to look at the telemetry. Now, even using telemetry to measure quality is challenging because you as a rider do not want the safest possible ride. If you wanted to minimize the risk of an accident, you'd stay home. The next best thing is, you might drive very slowly and not get on the highway and so on. And a lot of times you need to get to the airport. So the optimum from a consumer's perspective is going to be an interior optimum. And that presents a challenge for measuring quality. I see all of these metrics, but how do I know what the passenger really wants? And so the way we're going to do that is actually, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we're going to construct sort of a score for each ride using telemetry. But we're going to create the score by learning the relationship between the telemetry and star ratings. We're going to study data from Chicago, so we're going to have about 8 million rides from the city of Chicago. We did this in collaboration with Uber, where we got the data. This is the region we study. And in Chicago, Uber dispatches both UberXs and Uber taxis, so we have the equivalent telemetry measurement on both. Just to compare, taxis and Ubers are pretty similar, except taxis are twice as expensive and everything. But their relative payments for waiting and miles are about the same. When we look at ratings as just a direct way to compare rides, we have a few problems. First of all, almost every ride gets a 5-star. And I'll show you in a minute that many of the 3-star ratings come from passengers who always give 3 stars. So there's even less information in these star ratings than you might think. And in addition, people probably don't think the same way about giving a star rating to an Uber taxi as they do to an Uber X. So it's not clear that the stars are directly comparable apples to apples. So we don't want to directly use the star ratings. What we're going to do instead is use the Uber X star ratings to come up with a score that we can compare apples to apples. The score will be based on telemetry, which is measured the same across all cases. Just to give a sense of how the ratings and incentives work, if the driver's rating in the last 500 or the last 50 drops below 4.6, they get a notification. If it drops again, they get another notification. If it drops below 4.4, they get deactivated. Now, if you look out at the trips, we drop some things and so on, so we end up with 7.7 million trips in our sample. Most of the rides in our sample come from drivers who are nowhere near getting threatened, getting deactivated. So the deactivation incentive itself directly is not operating for most drivers. It's actually really hard to get deactivated. We do some back of the envelopes in the paper to show that for most drivers, even if they got a sequence of very bad ratings, they still wouldn't drop below the threshold for deactivation. But that's happening in the background. So only about 3% of rides are taking place by drivers who are even anywhere near the threshold of getting deactivated. As I mentioned before, if we can look at what is causing the different ratings. So this chart does a variance decomposition, which basically looks to see for each metric how much of the variation is due to the driver, how much is due to the rider, and how much is due to the trip. So if we start with the ratings row, we see that most of the variance in the rating is due to the rider. And so that's the thing that some riders just give everybody a 3-star. It's like being in class and having a harsh grading teacher. It doesn't really reflect the driver or the ride. It just reflects who's the passenger in the car. Now, this chart also looks at some of the other telemetry metrics that we use in this analysis. Again, it all comes from the core data is just the movements of the phone. That gets processed into through different classifiers and machine learning algorithms to say, was this phone mounted? Was this phone being handled? Was there a hard brake? Was there a hard acceleration? And they also look at the speed. For the speed, every single block that your Uber goes through gets a percentile rating based on that block. So if you drive through, from 1st to 2nd Street on K Street in Manhattan, they look at all the other Ubers that went through that same block, create a distribution of ratings, a distribution of speeds, and then look at where you fit on that distribution. So we get a very rich representation of the speed of your ride. We focus on 2 percentiles of that, basically how often were you really slow and how often were you really fast, and we do that using machine learning to choose those 2. Then we construct a score, which is basically where we take a rating for the Uber rides that were rated, and we build a regression model. We used regularized regression for the rating as a function of safety metrics, also controlling for the trip characteristics as well as the driver characteristics. And so what we end up with is a projection of the star ratings onto all of the telemetry, and this is just what some of the heat maps look like. And they show that there's generally an interior optimum for speed, for example. We then use that data to compare the telemetry of the Uber X's and the Uber taxis, where what we're going to be comparing is basically the predicted star rating. So we take an Uber taxi ride and an Uber X ride, and we say, based on the telemetry, this ride looks better than that ride in terms of how that telemetry would predict rider happiness. And this is an example, again, of using a proxy measure. The problem here is we don't observe ratings for lots of the the rides, and again, for the Uber taxis, we're not sure how to interpret them. So it's like a missing data problem, which is similar to not observing your final outcome until later. So we're using a big observational data set to figure out how to take our short-term metrics that are available for everyone, telemetry, and interpret them in terms of rider happiness. And what we find using a variety of different statistical techniques is that the Uber X's are statistically better than the Uber taxis. And the results range from about 1/10 of a standard deviation to about 1/5 of a standard deviation in terms of better. Now remember, the hypothesis going in was that the taxis were better than the Ubers, and we're able to very, very strongly reject that the taxis are better than the Ubers. The simplest statistical technique to think about this comparison is we take every Uber taxi trip, we look at that taxi trip in terms of the starting block, the ending block, and the time of day, and we find the nearest UberX trips, and we compare them in terms of their telemetry. Okay? So that way we make sure that we're comparing apples to apples when we do these comparisons. That's a matching estimator. We also use other estimators using fancier statistical techniques than the matching estimator, but basically it doesn't matter. We get the same result basically no matter what we do. So it's a very robust result. We then try to see what's going on. We look at how the UberX's respond to different conditions. So, for example, a lot of times in the morning when people are trying to get to work, they will pressure their Uber driver to drive faster. And so what we find is that the gap between the Uber taxis and the UberX's is actually smaller during the morning rush. And so we dig more into the data, we see that the Uber taxis are driving more aggressively than the UberX's, but in the morning, the passengers want you to drive aggressively, and we can show that in the data through the star ratings, so we see that basically the UberX's do drive more aggressively in the morning when the passengers want them to. Let me just skip ahead. We then try to understand a little more what's going on, because as I alluded to earlier, the threat of getting kicked off the platform is not sufficient to understand the motivation of the UberX drivers. There's some other reason that they're driving more responsibly than just getting kicked off the platform. So we run a randomized experiment. In this experiment, the drivers are going to be shown a tab in the app that shows them safety metrics to them. So they get this notification that says, you learn more about your driving. This information is just for you. You won't get kicked off the system. This is just information for you about how you're doing. The scorecard will then tell them how they compare to other drivers. And of course, if any of you don't like the way your spouse drives, you probably have had the conversation where you say, hey, can you drive a little more fast, or can you drive a little less bumpy? And they say, oh no, that's just you. I'm driving the way everybody wants to drive. It's you who have weird preferences. This will give you an objective notification that says, no, you are driving rougher than average. And so then the drivers get objective information that says that they are actually not in average. And so in this experiment, we have about 35,000 drivers treated, 24,000 control, and we look at the impact of the treatment, which the treatment is just receiving the information. And so what we find is that for most drivers, there's a positive effect, but it's not statistically significant. This is a little bit underpowered. But when we look at the people who were in the bottom 10 percentile of driving before the experiment began, those people made their driving better. And that's basically what you would expect, that this shouldn't really have an effect if you get told you're average, but if you get told you're below average, it should have an effect, and indeed it helps them improve. So what I think is really interesting about this is if we think about this AI-based surveillance and of workers overall, or of service providers, sometimes just telling people how they can improve may be enough. You don't have to necessarily fire them or penalize their wages. You can just tell them and they'll improve. So that, I think, supports the beneficial use of AI in this case. But as I mentioned, I think it's going to be really important for us as a society to do research on these things and to get some regulation and guidance ahead of time, because there's many ways this can go wrong, which could really give a backlash against AI as a whole. So I'll stop there and happy to take some questions. Thanks.
So regarding the sparsity of the ratings with the stars, right? Like you're saying that you have a lot of 5 stars and a little bit of the other ones. I've seen that in other customer satisfaction problems that I work before. I was wondering it, what are your thoughts about trying to change the metrics and be more binary? Because that's most of the thing that you're getting is kind of binary anyway. And in that way, you can get rid of those kind of in the middle things, the 3 stars. You force the user to decide if this was good or bad. Like happy face, sad face, kind of feedback.
That's a great question. So I think generally this topic of how to design rating systems is something that actually a lot of tech economists, so academics who are collaborating with tech firms from the economics, I'm an economist, have thought a lot about. And there's actually been some really big successes of academic collaborations helping firms fix their reputation systems. Simple things like retaliation, that people retaliate against a negative rating, so you can change the way the systems work. I think the next frontier is going to be to think more in a value of information framework. So first of all, the riders, the customers don't like giving bad ratings. That's clear. It makes them feel uncomfortable. You feel guilty when you give a bad rating. So by asking everybody to give a rating, you're actually imposing this negative cost. And in addition, you're taking your customers' time where you could have spent that same time offering them a coupon, telling them about another service or something else. So there's actually a real cost of getting this information. And the value of a lot of this information is basically zero. Because on average, you're not going to learn that much from another 5-star review if somebody has 10,000 5-star reviews. So I think we need to rethink this whole thing from more of an optimization perspective. If I can observe something directly from telemetry, I don't need to ask my customer about it. If I know when the eBay person shipped and the main thing that pisses people off is that they don't get their package on time, I don't need to ask the customer about that. So one thing you see a few cutting edge firms doing is asking more specific questions. You see that a little bit in the Uber app now too. Say, what was it that you liked? Was it the conversation? Was it that they did good driving? So that information is stuff that's harder to observe, and it actually is informative. So I guess my general thing would be, if you're going to waste people's time and make them feel guilty asking them a question, because they also feel guilty if they give a 5-star when they really did a bad job. If you're going to waste people's time, you should really get something out of it and really have a more quantitative and good conceptual framework for how to do that.
I had a question here, so I'll be honest. I'm one of the guilty persons of always giving a 5-star rating, regardless of the drive. But one thing I had a question there is, you were talking about safety. So it's not just that ride, right? Doesn't how long the driver been driving play a very important factor? But I don't see that being a metric, because I've seen that whenever there's a driver whose primary job is driving for Lyft or Uber, they're invariably driving 8-10 hours a day. Right, at which point, by end of the day, they're really tired, and that ride may not be as safe as a ride earlier in the day. So I was not seeing that metric called out, so I was curious.
Yes, so we did not study that. I think we might be a little bit underpowered for that. We looked at only one city, and these academic industry collaborations can be a little tricky because you make a data request and get one data set, but then you can't necessarily go back and do all of the follow-ons. So we didn't study that. I think that would be a really interesting thing to do. I guess what we can say is that to the extent that that's different between UberX's and Uber taxis, that the taxis dispatched by Uber, we're seeing better telemetry in the UberX's. So whatever it is about how long people are driving, on average, a typical UberX ride is going to have better metrics, but that doesn't answer directly your question of whether they're likely to fall asleep at the wheel or something else. Yeah, and I should say we also didn't study accidents for the same reason. 8 million rides is not enough to study accidents. Because there just aren't a lot of accidents. So you would need to take a longer time period, more cities, and have a more detailed data set to study accidents. So I really think of it here as we're trying to study more, is this ride a jerky, rough ride that makes the consumer unhappy, or is it a smoother ride that is giving a correct balance between speed and aggression?
Sort of 2 questions, but they both, I don't know if it's more of a human behavior question or a data question. So 2 sides. One is the driver. So you just provided us a lot of detail around rating drivers, sort of specific driving conditions. The drivers really understand that. If I'm a driver in downtown San Francisco and I just saw this, would I just say, I'm not going to ignore this because I know there's drivers in Pleasanton that don't have to deal with this sort of rush hour traffic I do? Do they understand how meaningful that data is to their specific driving habits? And then the other question is sort of on the other side of the consumer. So Uber I don't know, maybe a year ago, added the complement section. So I'm just wondering if that data is sort of what's compensating for the fact that I also am one of these guilty party. Actually, if I ever give a 3-star, there was a problem, like a real problem with the driver. So everyone gives 5 stars. So is that compliments thing somehow feeding into actually differentiating those all the 5-star drivers in the world?
Yes. So this data is from 2017 when tips were new, and so the ratings were the main thing. But I think that I exactly think that they're doing the compliments because the ratings are kind of useless. So they're exactly responding to that. In terms of whether the drivers think it's meaningful, one of the things we find that I didn't show you is that if for like randomly a driver gets a bad rating, and so how can I find a natural experiment where I give a driver a bad rating? Well, I can look at cases where they were assigned a consumer who always gives bad ratings. Or I can also look at situations where they were driving in an hour where there was an accident or something. So all the other drivers got bad ratings in that hour. And so that predicts them getting a bad rating. So when you, as a natural experiment, get a bad rating, the drivers actually get a much better rating on the next ride. But they don't change their safety too much. They don't change their telemetry. And so you can presume then that they're getting the better rating because they're asking for it, or they're giving a bottle of water or a piece of candy. They just got reminded that they need to worry about their ratings, and so they'll sort of be extra nice next time. So they may be accurately figuring out that while this telemetry is important, it's not the most important thing. So you may have to do more to kind of bring it to their attention, given that they realize that that's not the most important thing that's affecting their ratings. Giving candy may be, a better way to get a 5-star rating. All right, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.